All right, welcome to the Running in Place podcast, a Gen X take on a millennial world. And I'm Jack.
And this is Craig.
And this is our inaugural episode of our podcast, and we're very excited to be here. And Craig, do you have anything you want to start off with?
No, not really. I mean, I'm excited to do the podcast. I think that we will have something unique and worthwhile, I think, to offer the listeners, and I hope you guys get a lot out of it.
Cool. Well, yeah, I think that's a good way to start. Maybe we just start with kind of the concept here. Our concept for a show, I think, and I'll let Craig talk about this too, but of course, I think our concept for this show was really to say that we're living in a very interesting time and an interesting age, in that Craig and I are both sort of at the end of the Gen X, and we see the people that are following us, and we live in kind of crazy times. And this is trying to give our perspective both on things that are happening very contemporaneously, what's going on in the news, what's going on with culture, what's going on with popular culture, but then also trying to periodically take a look at the bigger picture and maybe talk about things that are happening. I don't know, do you have any kind of thoughts on that?
No, I think that's a good summary. I think what's interesting about maybe Gen Xers in general and us specifically is that I think we came around in a unique time in the dawning information age, in that, you know, the computer revolution started when we were old enough to appreciate it and experience it, and yet not too old to sort of have it pass us by. So I'm still, in my family, considered the IT guy. You know, my mom doesn't understand computers very well, so I've been around computers enough to understand that, and yet I am too old for what came after us. So, for instance, I don't really understand Instagram or what the point of that is or what people are doing on there. So that's kind of I think it's a unique spot, or an interesting spot in the computer age, and I think that we're not alone in that either, and that might be part of the perspective we're offering here.
That's a wow, I'd never thought of that. Okay, that's good. So here, back in history, there was the ancient world, and then at some point, starting right around the Italian Renaissance, things transferred and became modern. There's this concept of modernity, and before everything before modern was ancient, and then everything modern was modern. And I agree with that kind of summation, that we kind of straddled the fence on, let's call it, the industrial age, and that was what
that really, name's taken.
Yeah, it was taken. Yeah, I did not coin that. Just to be clear, I think there's a book or two or a reference to that somewhere on the internet. But the industrial age was kind of where we were brought up, and then still in our formative years, the information age took over dramatically and quickly, and has been very much a force to be reckoned with. And we straddle that, and that we remember the time pre-cell phone.
Yeah,
and yet we're very much still young in the era of information and of cell phones and of instant communication. The example that I've used is my grandma grew up without plumbing and without electricity in this house in Big Bay, Illinois. Seriously, I think there are 60 people in that town, or it's some ridiculously small number. And she, at the end of her life, I was FaceTiming with her. I was video conferencing with her. Now, it wasn't her iPad. It was some, my cousin would hand the iPad to her and say, "Hey, Grandma, it's Jack here. He wants to talk to you."
But she knew what was happening, right? She appreciated what she was experiencing.
She totally knew what was happening and really appreciated it.
She didn't think you were Zod in the mirror or anything.
No, it wasn't like, "Burn the witch." That'd be awesome. No, it wasn't magic to her. But at the same time, she grew up, it wasn't that long after flight had occurred.
Right. Yeah.
And then to see all of that happen and finally be able to talk to me in real time from hundreds of miles away was pretty astonishing. It's even amazing that you and I are sitting here just about 15 miles from each other, talking to each other with zero latency, like we're sitting next to each other.
It is. It is amazing, and we're using equipment to do this that either 20 years ago would have been unthinkable or outrageously expensive. And it's just sort of off the shelf stuff. It's commonplace now. It you don't think twice about it.
Well, and I'll admit, I don't listen to terrestrial radio anymore. And I'm not a snob. I'm not like one of those guys that, oh, that's so beneath me. It's just that I don't listen to terrestrial radio. If it's not Spotify or Google Music, it's, podcasts or
extra,
Audible.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I do Audible all the time. And the phone has become, well, I mean, it's a trope at this point, how people, not exactly a unique observation, but it's interesting how the phone, when we were growing up, was a way to talk to someone. And now it's like the 10th thing that it's used for on the list of most common things.
Yeah, no, I both of my sons have phones, and it's a gaming device, it's a texting device, it's everything else. Yeah. And oh yeah, hey, they can remember to answer the phone once in a while.
I don't know if my daughter's ever made a call on her phone, actually.
Mine have made very few. In fact, I get kind of panicked when they do call me just because they don't ever do that.
I would have loved it, though, frankly, growing up. I mean, that was, well, particularly if you're making a call like that you're a little nervous about, like, say, to a girl or something. How much easier it would have been to do a text instead of a call. I mean, these guys, they don't know how hard it could have been.
Yeah. No, it's a different kind of thing. Why don't we talk for a second, maybe just about, the generational concept, because we've kind of touched on it here in a couple of different ways, and it's in the title of our podcast. Mm-hmm. So at least starting since the people that I've ever been aware of. So we'll call it the modern era. So there's, you've heard the phrase, I think Tom Brokaw actually coined this phrase, although if I'm wrong, please don't flame me, the greatest generation. These were the people born from 1910 to 1924. So these would have been, in large part, the older people fighting the Second World War. These would have been the majors and the colonels and the generals and the first sergeants, and these would have been decision makers in the Second World War. So
I thought greatest generation meant people who fought in World War II. Like, I thought my grandfather was part of the greatest generation, but he was definitely born after 24.
Yeah, well, there's two, and I guess I never thought of this either. I thought all of them would have been the greatest generation. I totally concur with that.
They were greater than me, that's for sure.
Yes, indeed they were, and me too. I'm not taking a swipe at you there. No, me too.
Yeah.
But no, there's the silent generation that was born from 25 to 45. Now, those were the ones who maybe didn't make a lot of decisions, but still fought in World War II. Those were the people that were the lieutenants or the privates.
Well, surely not 45.
Yeah, not 45, but kind of up to the end of the war, they kind of had to pick. So there was a big part of that generation that was either fought in World War II or kind of were at the immediate aftermath of World War II.
Right.
But with the greatest generation, they were alive and somewhat potentially, I guess, in their formative years during the Depression. Whereas the silent generation kind of started off maybe born in the Depression, but really not aware. I mean, I'm sure they were aware of it, but really not participants in it. They were kids or young kids or grade schoolers in the Depression, and then came the war.
Right. They would have been, and I don't mean to cut you off, but they would have been, actually, just as an aside, let's avoid doing things like that. What I just did, saying things like, I'm sorry to cut you off there.
No, go ahead.
That takes people out of the moment. So I don't want to, I'm going to try to make an effort to not say something like that.
All right. You're a dick. Go ahead.
Huh? Okay. And of course I'll set aside time where I'm not going to be interrupted. And I forgot what I was going to say. But the what we're calling the silent generation, or what has been called the silent generation, I think it's an important part of what defines them is probably the fact that they were raised by people who experienced the Depression, and so their parents were probably frugal and or self-sufficient or distrusting perhaps of institutions in a way that the generation after probably didn't experience.
Yeah. No, I think that's very much the case. They were really kind of fostered in an area of individualism, but
Mhm.
then kind of, I mean, I like the distrust of institutions, certainly, but then a thriftiness, almost I guess maybe a distaste of reckless consumption. I don't know. There's a way to say that. They did not see that as appropriate.
Right. Right.
And
agree.
I always use my grandma as an example, because my grandma lived directly across the street from a Dairy Queen. And so when my family would come to town, very often we hadn't eaten in hours and hours and hours, and she loved feeding people. But a lot of times what she was feeding people were leftovers, and at least towards the end of her life, you had no idea how long those leftovers are there, who made them.
Sure.
I mean, it was, I'm not saying it was questionable, but it was questionable.
It was botulism roulette.
Yeah. And, you got little kids, and I'm like, are they going to be cool with this? And I just need to keep them kind of quiet and happy because they're at grandma's house. And trust me, grandma's house is boring if you're a little kid.
Mm-hmm.
So we'd get there and we'd be like, no, grandma, I'm going to walk across the street and get a couple of cheeseburgers from Burger King or from Dairy Queen. And it would offend her to no end that I would go buy $9 worth of cheeseburgers rather than eat her leftovers. It would offend her.
Mm-hmm.
And it was because she was that generation that grew up in the Depression. And why are you going to spend good money when I have food right here?
Right. I do think that's if not a defining, then certainly a common trait of those generations. And I mean, there's something to be said for that kind of attitude, as opposed to, consumerism as it's increasingly taken hold in the generations that followed. So there's something to be said about that approach. Although, there's also something to be said for, we've got a lot going on, right? So we can't, there's a trade-off there between convenience and frugality.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, all right. So the Silent Generation and the Greatest Generation fought in World War II. And then
Who's the definitive? Who defines where the generations cut off and stuff? Where is there like a international body that sets these, or what's? Where can we look up the guide to generations?
I got most of my dates off of Wikipedia, but as far as I can tell, really what this is a bunch of kind of pop social scientists who want to write books. And so they throw out a book like Tom Brokaw. He's a journalist. He writes a book called The Greatest Generation. So he's got to pick a date. You got to pick one. All right, you're going to start here. You're going to end here. So there's another one I'll mention later called Xennials. So, this used to be easy. You had Gen X and then you moved into millennials. But no, Xennials are this group that straddle in between. So there's actually, I don't think there's one hard and fast rule. It's kind of all over the place.
All right. But generally, I think when we talk about the baby boomers, we kind of know we're talking about our parents, if it's you and me, right, and our
Totally.
Our friends' parents, yeah. So okay, and we're the ones after that. We're the Gen Xers.
Yeah, we're that. What do they call that? A demographic cohort, and we are the Gen Xers, and that's fine. Gen Xers are great. There's lots of different. I'm trying to find it right now. There's lots of different rules on when the Gen Xers started more than ended. Well, I skipped one. Hold on. I apologize. I just skipped one. The baby boomers. They came.
It's my fault. I took you away from there.
That's all right. So they started right after World War II. Roughly, it started in 1945. And I've actually lost my notes here, so I'm trying to find it where they ended. I want to say they ended around 1980, but that sounds too big to me. Now you don't.
No, that would make you and me boomers.
Yeah, no, I think it was around 1970.
That's something like that. Basically, when the people who came home from World War II stopped having kids, right?
Yeah, essentially that's it. I'm losing it here.
You would think mid to late 60s, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And my brother was 67, and he's definitely considered a Gen Xer. So yeah, it was probably mid 60s or something.
Mm-hmm.
And so the boomers were the ones that came after World War II, and their parents, the greatest generation of the silent generation, they were, I guess, conservative. And I guess, I mean, I
Sure.
don't know. I don't necessarily mean that politically, but because many of them were Democrats. But I think by today's standards, they were very conservative or traditional. Maybe that's a better word, you think?
I think that's a good word, and it's I don't know how we would gauge their their social mores other than through media, right? And when we look at media, certainly we see a much more conservative or traditional lifestyle portrayed than what we see today. But I don't know if that's actually reflective of society. I assume it is. Why would they tune in to watch if it wasn't something that they were familiar with? But yeah, it certainly seems that it was certainly much more, at least traditional, than how we would view today.
Well, and sorry, just to stay on the silent and the greatest generation for a minute. These are the people that after the war, and I was thinking about this in the car this morning. These are the people that after the war rebuilt Europe. These are the people that came home into corporate America. And I don't mean that in the negative sense, like, oh, those corporate bastards. I mean it in the sense of these are the people that came back and got jobs and were aggressive and capitalistic, pardon the phrase, and they built modern America. Now you can argue, well, they built consumer culture, and you can argue if that's good or bad or not or whatever. But I mean, these are the people that came home. They did impressive things during the war. They stopped fascism. And then they came home and they almost, and I'll go so far as to say, ended the ability to have a third world war by exploding the economy and making the world a much smaller place where we're much more interdependent on each other. I mean, they invented advertising for all practical purposes. Think about all the things that got developed between the 40s and the 50s and the 60s.
Yeah, it was a crazy time when you look back on it in terms of how that period in at least American history echoes throughout our time today. I can hear that, by the way.
Hear me taking a drink?
Yeah, I don't know if you have a mute button. I don't have one. I've got a software one on Skype.
Oh yeah, I guess I do. I'll pay more attention to that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But anyway, I mean, they did these kind of amazing things. They really did. I think they rebuilt the world. I mean, we had 2 world wars. In fact, there's historians that argue there was really only 1 world war, but there was a 20-year armistice in between, battles. I mean, the world, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people died. And this is the generation that came that rebuilt it afterwards and rebuilt cities. Entire European cities were destroyed, but they got rebuilt. Well, then come the boomers. Yay, boomers. That's my dad. My dad's, right at the front end of the boomer generation. And they rejected all that. They rejected the traditional values. These are the ones that started off becoming the hippies. But at the same time, they were more educated than their parents were. They were wealthier than their parents were. Certainly now, the boomers hold the lion's share of wealth in the world, but certainly in the Western world. But they were
I'm
also
curious what you mean by when they which traditional values did they reject? I mean, so when I think traditional values, I think, and maybe we have different definitions of this, and that's why I'm asking the question. But I think having a family, providing for that family, staying with your wife, faithfulness, work ethic, that kind of thing. And I think the boomers, I mean, the free love 60s notwithstanding, those kids grew up and put on a tie and went to a job. And I think the boomers, at least from my perspective, having been raised by them, had quite a lot of traditional values and maybe even more values than we're seeing in the generations beneath us.
I certainly don't disagree with that last part. I think in many ways they do. All right, so I guess maybe to rephrase, but maybe to explain that a little bit. That was the generation that largely abetted, by maybe birth control, were the free love generation. Divorce exploded. Now you can make an argument. I don't think it's an unnatural argument or wrong argument that maybe things weren't so perfect in the 50s, and maybe women weren't always treated well, and this empowered women to be masters of their own fate. Okay. But that concept of we're the family unit, we're staying together no matter what, ended. So all of a sudden,
Right.
divorce became a thing. It was traditional that women stayed home and men went to work. All
Right.
of a
Okay.
sudden,
So
that was no longer
societal
traditional.
pressures. Yeah. Right. Okay. Societal social mores changed such that a woman who was contemplating, who maybe would have wanted to get divorced in the 40s, felt no social anti-pressure to do that in the 70s.
Yeah, I think that's very much the case. And
Okay.
to say that promiscuity abounded is wrong. I don't mean promiscuity because that feels like I'm casting a negative aspersion on the people that were doing it. I'm not. I'm just saying that the traditional male and women roles and the traditional ways that men and women behaved through a series of things was really allowed to very quickly change between, say, 1955 and 1975. So geologically, 20 years is a very short period of time. But if you were to look at, when the Beatles did Love Me Do and when the Beatles released, Abbey Road, in a very short period of time, they were radically different.
Right.
And
Were they a symptom or a cause of the change?
I would
They were
say
part of it.
but
Yeah,
they were
yeah.
certainly there at the moment.
Right.
And I think they're a good analogy to represent it.
And your point is well taken, particularly given that I am personally a product of a pregnancy out of wedlock, which which happened in the mid 70s, and which presumably 10 to 20 years earlier would have been scandalous.
Yeah,
And I think it
absolutely.
was partially scandalous, I think, when it happened, but certainly not as life threatening as it would have been. And I don't mean like literally life threatening, but
Right.
life altering or whatever. Or
Yeah, maybe future
reputation
threatening.
destroying. Yes,
Yeah.
right. As it would have been in the earlier generation. Well, frankly, it probably wouldn't have happened. Like my parents would have gotten married if an unintended pregnancy had happened, the generation before.
Yeah, the family would have forced it.
Right.
It wouldn't have been a question.
Mm-hmm.
So the boomers, they were they were different than their parents, and they were marked by, say, Vietnam. But at the same time, it wasn't the same kind of thing as World War II, where that was on the home front, that was fighting the good fight. This was moral and ethical. And in Vietnam, the people didn't necessarily see it as the people at home, especially now. At the time, I do wonder how it was really thought of at the time, but certainly now, if you look back on the Vietnam War, everybody thinks of, the anti-war movement, how immoral and unethical this was, although, I question at the time if they quite saw it that way, or if everybody did. I think those that fought it became the thought leaders that have now told us, oh no, back in the day, everybody was like this. And I don't know that that's necessarily true.
Well, I don't think we could. We're in a position to know that we weren't there,
Right.
and maybe even the people who were there, maybe their perceptions are tainted by their changing views as well.
Yeah, I think that's true. So, but then the boomers they gave birth to us, the Gen Xers. But we were raised by boomers, although I was raised by a particularly conservative set of boomers. I don't think of my parents as boomers, even though they by every single definition were. My parents share many more of the characteristics of, say, the silent generation than boomers, but they were boomers, early boomers. But the boomer or the Gen Xers were a little bit different because we had both sets of groups in our lives. Our grandparents were the greatest or the silent generation. Our parents were boomers, so we'd see the difference between those two. But we weren't defined by this great war or this great, or anti-war.
Mm-hmm.
But we were the first group. I mean, latchkey kids. Do you remember that? Remember that phrase?
I was a latchkey kid. Yeah,
I was a latchkey kid too. And for those maybe listening that don't know what a latchkey kid is, the concept was this was the first generation of kids, of young people that grew up where both parents worked. And you would come home and you wore a key around your neck or in your pocket. But, I don't know if you did, on a string, I had a key around my neck.
Yeah, me too. Shoestring.
And then Mine was just a string, but so your shoestring, so that's a better story. Um, and we'd unlock the door, and we would spend an hour or 2 hours at the end of the day by ourselves.
And this is at an age that would shock the conscience probably today. I am quite sure that I was a latchkey kid from fourth grade, possibly third, but definitely by fourth grade, I was spending at least a couple hours a day alone in the house or outside. I mean, I didn't necessarily stay in the house.
No. Well, for me, it was the summer after third grade. So I guess that makes me a fourth grader. And all summer, well, not only at night, but all summer, I was home by myself. And that was today. I think that's illegal. Don't you have to be like 13 today or something, or 12?
I mean, I haven't looked this up very in much detail, but my understanding is that it's really like a judgment call. It's like you have to be responsible or something. I don't know that. I think there might be guidelines legally, but I don't think it's like they can haul you away necessarily.
Yeah. Okay.
I think it's up to the discretion of the officer, but don't take that as legal advice.
Yes, nothing, folks. Nothing we say here is legal advice. Please, just let's be clear about that. We're going to need a disclaimer at the start of the show. But we were the ones that grew up without a huge adult presence in our lives, and my parents grew up in the same town as their parents and grandparents, and so there was, even though at least on my dad's side, the family was relatively small. He was an only child, which was unheard of back then. But there was lots of family in the town where, there was this big migration to the suburbs. In my case, my family moved up from the south because, there was work in the north. And so I grew up in a suburb of a bunch of houses that looked very similar without a lot of family nearby. And, kind of without my adult presence being around all that often. I don't know if you had.
It is similar. It is similar. You spent a lot of time outdoors and with the neighborhood kids. Occasionally getting in fights, not often, but working things out amongst yourself. What I would say, at least the cynical part of me wants to say, is developing skills that I worry that some of the generations after us have not been able to foster as well, or at least as independently, because we're all scared they're going to get diddled.
Yes, I think I have a tattoo. All right, kids, when you go out today, don't let anybody diddle you.
Yes.
But we were the first generation that grew up integrated. My dad remembers.
Do you mean racially integrated?
I mean, racially
integrated. Where are we going here? Okay, all right.
Well, no, I mean racially integrated because my dad, which grew up in the South, he remembers colored only. Is that what the signs were? He remembers seeing signs like that. In fact, I'll tell a quick story if you don't mind. If we have just a second. So I went with my dad to Kentucky Lake when I was, I couldn't have been 10, 11 years old. And we were supposed to go fishing. And of course, I wanted to do everything else under the world and go fishing with my dad, which today I'd love to go fishing with my dad. So we go fishing and we don't catch anything. It's miserable hot. This is in Kentucky. And we leave about lunchtime. Well, we end up driving by this little cafe, which my dad loved, those crappy little cafes. So a little greasy spoon. So we stop in and we eat at the counter. Because when it was just me and my dad, we always ate at the counter. And it's the red Formica top with the silver railing around it, the circular spinning stools that I would always spin around on, and I'd get a face when I was goofing around too much. Sure. And I swear to God, I'm not making this up. I totally remember this. There's this sign on the side of the cash register, because the counter turned and went vertical for a second, and that kind of protected the cash register from whatever. And there's this little hand-carved wooden sign that said something to the effect of, "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone," or something like that, or "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone we choose," something to that effect. And my dad pokes me and goes, "Hey, you see that sign?" And I look at it and I read it, and he goes, "Do you know what that means?" And of course, at the time I'm a dumbass. So I'm like, oh, of course I do. And I wasn't quite sure, but I thought I knew. And he goes, you'll never see that again. Remember that you've seen that. And I go, okay. Well, I swear to God, not 2 minutes later, a black family walks into the restaurant. And in my mind, they looked exactly like the Huxtables, which, remember, it's 100 degrees out. So I'm sure the guy was not wearing some, beautiful patterned sweater. But this black family walks in. And I remember this clear as day. The wife turns to, and I assume husband and wife, I don't actually know that, but the waitress, who seemed to be kind of out front, and then the man who was the cook in back, she turns and looks to the cook in back, and he steps out of the kitchen. And before the black family can even say a word, he goes, "This is to go, right?" And the husband's kind of flummoxed for a second, and then the wife, who's clearly more on the ball, goes, "Yes, this is to go." And they order, and we had already ordered. So my dad and I had already ordered, and they ordered. And I swear their food came out. They didn't sit down. They stood right there at the counter. I swear their food came out in like 2 seconds. I'm sure it was longer than that. I have no doubt. I was a little kid. What do I know? And I remember being miffed because I'm like, hey, we ordered first. Why isn't our food out here? And they get their food and they leave. And I saw it, and I didn't fully kind of understand what was going on. And then we get in the car, and my dad says, "All right, did you see that?" I go, "Yeah, I saw that." He goes, "You'll never see that again. That is very likely, the last time that will ever happen." Now, of course, in Kentucky, I'm sure it's not the last time it ever happened. But in my life, that was, I think, the first and only time that I've seen something even close to that level of, actual, like, malignant prejudice.
So, my natural skepticism is peaking in that, maybe this guy knew this person, maybe they were regulars, maybe your young mind was interpreting it differently. But the fact that your dad seemed to be cued into the situation as something nefarious going on suggests that maybe that is something, which strikes me as odd in the mid '80s. I don't think I ever had any experiences like that in the '80s.
To be honest, this couldn't have been earlier than 1985.
Mm-hmm.
I would be shocked if it were maybe 84. So I would have been 9 potentially. But it's one of those things that I've even questioned that memory. And my dad and I've never really talked about it, but he does remember that it happened. But he and I have never really said, maybe I should do that. Maybe I should try to sit down and see if he remembers it still. But I vividly remember that, and I was like, holy crap. But we were the generation that grew up kind of after that. There were black kids in my school. There was Bangladeshis. I grew up in I would even say a fairly white school, but it was, certainly integrated. My neighborhood was certainly integrated. But
yeah, I don't think we don't have to keep a secret that we went to the same school, at least secondary school, and it was quite integrated. In fact, it has become less integrated as time has gone by, but not in the way one might think.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. But it's something that we were exposed to that our parents and our forebears never were, but we were the first kids to get computers. In fact, did you have a computer before me? You might have. It was
before you, but I know our family had one very early on.
You were the one who showed me America Online.
Okay. Yeah, that was, but we were you were computerized before America Online. Certainly, we were dialing up BBSs long before America Online.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
All right. Why don't you explain what BBSs are?
Yeah. So BBSs would be like instead of one place where you dial into the internet, you dial into all of a bunch of, well, I would say your friends, but also it could be someone you don't know, as long as you've got the number, of basically private networks that are not necessarily connected to each other, but you can become connected to them for a given session. Typically, we're talking, or always we're talking about a modem line. So, how I remember the modems, it went 2400 baud and then 56K, and I think there were other iterations in between. So you would dial up to this computer, and this computer would have one or more phone lines that were set to answer the phone, and you would make a connection with it, and you could. There were, it was in some ways there are analogies to comment sections of websites, but they were called bulletin boards, and maybe that's still a thing. I mean, 4chan's kind of
forum, maybe.
Yeah, forum. Yeah, sure, forum. And it was sort of there were also IMs. I mean, I met my first real girlfriend on one of these BBSs. I IM'd her to ask her if she wanted to go out sometime, because I was cripplingly shy.
If I could say, and I was going to say this before you brought it up, that pre-internet, you won the internet. You won. You got it. You were the one guy in America that not only met a girl and got dates and got a girlfriend on a computer, but she was a babe too.
She was, yeah. No, it was she was not. She was way out of my league too, such that and she, this is a joke now to say this, but she really did go to a different school. So
she's in Canada.
She's in Canada, and she's Canadian too. She was Canadian.
She is Canadian. See, that's how people know we're going to make this up. No, that can't be true.
I know. So I would tell people in my school that I had a girlfriend, and I didn't really find out until later that most people did not believe me.
No, we were all jealous. It really was true. But it's funny, just to reflect for a minute. BBSs were the internet of one, so you could log in, and then I could log in, and then somebody else could log in, and somebody else could log in, and somebody else could log in, and then you could log in again to see if somebody responded to your message.
Right.
Which is exactly where the internet has gone with 4chan and Reddit and even Facebook to a degree. It's you look for the comments underneath your post. And it's funny how here we are. Are we 25 years out? What year would that have been? 1990? No, 88?
We're more than 25. Yeah.
So we're more than 25 years out, and yet really the internet didn't change anything.
Yeah, we have come full. Well, I think what that might demonstrate is that the internet has facilitating something that is useful and desired, and that is, both instantaneous and also asynchronous communication via words, via text. I think texting also is part of this. There's an appeal to communicating with over the written word as opposed to verbally, which I think is what makes texting and the kind of communication we're talking about here, 4chan, Reddit, that kind of thing, so appealing. There's a reason that I find myself texting my wife 8 times a day rather than what could have been said in a 5-minute phone call. For some reason, it's just appealing, and maybe that's something we could explore maybe in a different episode. But
yeah, no, I
think that's interesting.
So that was us. We were the first generation, the Gen Xers. We had computers. We had computerization. We had all of the things that the generations before us kind of built. Were kind of building. Came to its natural conclusion. Computers were now in the home with us. I got my first actual PC, I think in the 8th or 9th grade, but I think it was the 8th grade. And my dad even sent my brother, because my dad was terrified of computers. He hated them. And I remember this. And so he sent my brother, and he gave my brother money to go buy me a computer. My brother didn't want a computer. My brother wanted a stereo. So my brother got the stereo, but I got a computer. And and
it was considered yours. You had Jack's computer.
It was in my room.
Wow.
It was my computer. And
Yeah,
my
that
dad
was rare.
my dad didn't want to look at it. He didn't want to be around it. It was as if it offended him somehow. And maybe he was right, who knows. But so it was mine, but he didn't know what I was going to do with it. He just had heard that it was good and it would make kids smarter or something. So he got it. And it's funny because I had to learn, unlike my kids, my kids are actually surprisingly not computer literate. I can't give my 14-year-old, I can't give him a device where I don't set it up for him necessarily.
Really?
It's weird.
I could see them being like Windows ignorant, or because their world isn't on. We've kind of gone past the PC now for our kids' generation. But it surprises me a little bit that he feels the same way about devices. I mean, my kids seem to know their way around that stuff intuitively.
Well, there are parts of it he certainly does, but I'm just surprised sometimes how not inquisitive they are towards the devices. They simply want the devices to work, but they aren't interested in how they work. Where for me, I had to sit down and learn it all from the ground up, from the first time I turn it on to, everything. Playing F-19 Stealth Fighter, which was an awesome friggin' early PC game.
Yeah, I mean, I remember there were. Do you remember BASIC? I don't know if you ever. I did a little bit of BASIC program, but it was also, you would have to you would get certain programs that were compiled on BASIC, and you'd have to type in the command, load this or run this.
Yeah. 10 run, 20 go to this, 30 go to this.
Yeah.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I learned BASIC, and I learned, I think, a hint of Fortran, but I remember BASIC. I don't remember any Fortran. But then you have. So here we were. I'm not saying it was like Lord of the Flies or anything, but we did not have a lot of supervision. And so lots of kids did lots of dumb things, but mostly survived it. And those that didn't probably weren't really meant to. But then along come the millennials. So here we are, the generation that grew up a little bit Lord of the Flies-ish, a little bit, kind of on our own, and, the winner take the spoils kind of thing. And again, it wasn't like that. But it felt that way sometimes. And then here we are, the generation that gave birth to the most sheltered generation. We're the helicopter parents. Or certainly I was. I don't know if you were. I was a helicopter parent. I'm not so much anymore.
Well, I mean, in some ways, you don't have much choice because, I mean, we hear these stories, and I like to think that there's a movement away from this. But when we had young kids, you would be called on, like communist Russia style by your neighbors if they suspected you weren't hovering over your children. If they saw children unaccompanied or walking to the park alone, you can get the police called on you, because we're all, this was the what is it, Adam Walsh or whoever that kid was.
Oh my God, yeah.
Yeah, this is what we were dealing with, right? Is this fear because of I think there's a lot of things at play here, but I would blame primarily, nationwide news coverage, of which tends to amplify small things into looking like big problems, and so we were all afraid our kids were going to get kidnapped. So you can't, or we're afraid that that the guy next door is a pedophile or something. And I've still, that's a real fear. Like I would, like if I found out my kids were at a neighbor's house and that there weren't other kids there, and it was just an adult, I would freak the F out. I would assume that something bad had happened. And I'm saying this to contrast it with my own child that I distinctly remember. There was an old guy in the neighborhood who was just an old, lonely guy. And we would all go into his house, and he liked company. I don't think there was anything nefarious. Certainly nothing untoward ever happened to me.
Did he diddle you?
He did not diddle me. As far as I know, he didn't diddle anyone, and he would give us butterscotch candies. And he was just a guy who just it's hard to tell the story without making it seem weird, but it wasn't weird.
You wake up and you're like, Mr. Cosby. No.
But that's just, I mean, I didn't think twice. My parents didn't think twice about it. It was fine.
No, it was a normal. I would go to at my grandma's. I would go to the neighbor's house and hang out with them because they were kind of neat older people,
Yeah.
and that was kind of it. But the millennials, and I don't want to bash millennials, but it's one of those things where I think we became our own worst enemy. We gave birth.
Huh? We're
to
just kind
this,
of doing a test
to
run.
this incredibly entitled generation, and now this entitled generation is moving into the workforce. I work with one right now. He's employee of the same company I work for, and he's a young guy and he's educated, and he does just because he's educated doesn't mean he knows anything. He actually doesn't, or very little, and he's learning by the day, and he's going to be good someday, and he really thinks that he should run the place. And he came into me the other day. And it's funny, we're getting ready to start this podcast, and so he comes in and he's asking me what the proper way to object to an HR policy is. and
Really?
I'm very kind of libertarian about things, and I'm like, well, this is how you do it. I'll give you one of two ways to do it, and both of them end up being the same kind of thing. So let's talk about what you have going on. And he's explaining why he objects to the policy. And I'm like, okay, I understand your objection to the policy. And I'm not telling him that I actually objected strenuously to the policy. And several, of the higher level executives did. But we ultimately lost, and we are now, we are now required to carry out
the law of the
policy.
land.
It's the law of the land. It is what it is. And but I'm not telling him that necessarily. And so he's going on and on about this policy, and I explained some things about the policy to him, and come to find out he hadn't read the policy. He didn't understand the policy, and he had come in to object. And here's what bugged me, though, and this is where I kind of look at myself, and I'm like, oh, maybe, I don't know, this is where I've got to look at myself a little bit. It didn't offend me that he wanted to object to the policy. You want to object to the policy, rock on. That I feel very strongly about that. You should have the right to object if you need to, or if you feel that it's important. But when I asked him, I said, what do you want to accomplish? Are you looking to get this policy changed? He said no. He really just wanted to complain about it to somebody, and not just to me. He didn't.
Okay.
When I asked him, do you want to change the policy? He said no. And I even asked him again, are you sure? I mean, what are you looking to do for this? He just wanted to complain. I'm like, well, fine. I got on him a little bit about not having read the policy and kind of sent him away. I was done talking to him at that point. You want to change something? Come on, I'll help you change it. But if you just want to whine, piss off. I'm not interested anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're seeing is some of the effects of not allowing our children to make mistakes and learn these things on our own, and sort of being constantly on our protection. And I've got a somewhat analogous but thankfully shorter story.
Sorry. That felt like a shot, so sorry.
At our job, it was, a coworker around my age was telling the story that one of the interns, I guess, was talking about housing or something, and saying, well, he was having trouble, I don't know, getting sign off on his apartment lease or something. Maybe it was an intern, maybe it was a new employee. Anyway, it wasn't our problem, right? So, we were like, and she said, well, I was being sympathetic to him, and in the sense of, sure, this sounds, like sounds like a pickle you're in there. But he, what became clear is that he was looking for her to solve his problem, which a problem, in other words, it didn't occur to him that he had to solve this. And I think that's a bit of sort of a small example of what our generation sometimes may be frustrated about with the generation below us, is that we learned, and maybe it's not the generation below us's fault, but we learned to solve our own problems, whereas I think the generation below us has not had that skill and expects people to fix things for them. people or the government or authority figures or someone in such that they don't consider themselves capable, or it doesn't even occur to them to solve their own problems.
That's actually a pretty good segue to something I wanted to talk about.
Oh, are we going to wrap this up?
Yeah, we can. We can wrap this up. This has been good. And this is a great inaugural episode. I mean, we're certainly not going to talk so much about the generations in the future, except probably bitching about millennials. But
right,
no,
yeah. I mean, so if we're going to break it down, I mean, I think this is really good. I think that I would go more on. I would make it a little less like a history lesson.
Definitely, yes. We'll never do this again.
Yeah. But to the extent that we can use the outline to bounce off our personal experiences, or our personal thoughts about things, or our thoughts as someone of our age, or someone who went through our experiences, what was it like to have Boomer as parents, which we did go into a little bit. I think that's good. I think there's some meat there.
No, definitely. I totally agree. Well,
and I think we should shoot for like 30 to 45 minutes. I think we're testing, particularly when we begin. I'm willing to listen to your opinion if yours differs from mine. But I think we're testing people's patience if we go too long on something.
I completely agree. I think we can be more concise, and by we, I mean me.
I'll be putting you back.
And then I think 30 to 45 minutes is the perfect time for a commute. I think you've got to be pretty special. You've got to have something really to contribute to go longer than a commute time.
Yeah, or like a guest or something. I mean, but yeah, I think if we can try to keep the conversation shorter, I think that'd probably be good.
Cool. All right. Well,
yeah, I think our back and forth was good. I think our balance of you talking and me talking was good. I think it went well. It didn't feel like work.
Well, let me just give a natural segue here, and then we'll probably talk offline a little bit after this. This has been the inaugural episode of the Running in Place podcast, which is a Gen X take on a millennial world. And I'm Jack.
And Craig.
And he totally caught that cue. You see, we know each other. And thank you, everybody. And we hope you like it. And I promise we will suck less next time.
But I'm ching.
Come on, I like that.
I was slipping out of character there at will. I didn't realize we were supposed to stay in character.
I don't think you got out of character.
Well, that whole last part, I intended that to me like